do a video on working with square roots. Hopefully in this video tutorial, we're going to talk about what a square root is, look at some perfect squares, look at estimating square roots, and then just getting familiar to working with your calculator. All right, so let's think about what we have. We know in math, I can take a number, 3, and I can add a number to it, plus 5, to get 8. But then there's an opposite sign. If I subtract 5 from 8, we get right back to what we started with, right? So I start with 3, I end with 3, and we have this opposite sort of interaction. I can add 5 and then subtract 5, and those are opposites. So addition and subtraction are opposite operations. We also have the same thing for multiplication, right? If I take 3, I can multiply it by 5 to get 15. But then the opposite of multiplying is to divide by 5, and I get right back to 3, where I started with. So multiplication and division are also opposite or inverse operations. Well, let's think now about squaring. What if I take the number 3 and we square it? So 3 squared gives you 9, because that's 3 times 3. What is it that's going to do the opposite of squaring and get me back to 3? In math, we love to be able to do something and then undo it. If I'm wanting to undo squaring, this is where we get introduced to square roots. Square root is the opposite of squaring. So if I have 3 squared equals 9, I can take the square root of 9, which says, well, what number times itself gives you 9? And it gets me back to 3. So square root is the opposite of squaring. We'll be doing a lot of square root stuff in your algebra class, your algebra 2 class, your pre-calc class, all that good stuff. And so we just want a good introduction to what a square root is. It's an operation that is the opposite of squaring, but it's related to squaring in terms of powers. Okay, let's list out some perfect squares here, perfect square roots. For dealing with squares and square roots, we want to be really familiar with these numbers here. So 2 squared is 4, so the square root of 4 gives me back to 2. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared is 36. 7 squared is 49. 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is 81, and 10 squared, 10 times 10 is 100. And so if you think about it on the flip side, if you ever see any of these numbers, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, the square roots of all those numbers are going to work out nicely. For example, let's take this. The square root of 64 has to equal 8, because 8 squared equals 64. The square root of 25 equals 5, because 5 squared equals 25. So those are what we call perfect squares. These numbers over here, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, those are perfect square numbers because I can square root them and end up with a nice even number, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, but there are lots of numbers that are not perfect squares. Take, for example, what if we have the square root of 60? Well, 60 doesn't show up on here. And so here's where we actually kind of have to estimate it. So the square root is 60. Well, let's think about what we have going on here. 64, I can square root. 64 is bigger than 60, and that gives me 8. So the square root of 64 equals 8. But I also have 49. 49 is the only one less than 60, and the square root of 49 equals 7. So what can I conclude about the square root of 60? Well, since 60 is in between 64 and 49, the square root of 60 has to be in between 8 and 7. In fact, it's probably a little bit closer to 8 because 60 itself is closer to 64. So I'm going to say it's in between, let me write that a little better, in between 7 and 8. So I got a good estimate. It's like probably 7.6, 7.7, 7.8, somewhere in that range. So anytime you're working with numbers, some of them are going to square root nicely, but you also want to have a good estimate of what a square root of a number kind of should be based on knowing all these perfect squares. All right, finally, you want to know how to use this on your calculator. So your calculator can handle square roots. Let's do the square root of 60. You want to look for a button with the little radican symbol, little radical symbol right there. If I hit that button, sometimes you have to type in 60 first and then hit that button. Sometimes you have to hit that button and then type in 60 and then hit enter. You'll just have to play around with your particular type of calculator to do that. But if you do it right, the square root of 60 should be 7.74596, and the last digit 7, I'm just rounding because it goes on and on and on. It's an irrational number, so it'll keep going on. But there you go. That's approximately what the square root of 60 is, 7.7459. And we can see that, yeah, we were right. It is in between 7 and 8. So here we go. Sum it all up. Square root of a number is the opposite of squaring. So we need to be able to be comfortable with taking square roots of numbers. Some of them are perfectly square rooted. We call them perfect squares. Some of them we have to estimate or use our calculator and find an approximation to.